Okay, so now we're entering Numbers 20. And with Numbers 20, there's going to be a time skip, although the text does not indicate as such. But we are now going to jump about 40 years in time to the end of their punishment in the wilderness. So we really don't get much of an indication of anything that happened during the 40 years they were wandering around. Now, a few chapters from now, we are going to get a list of their itinerary in terms of their campsites. That doesn't happen here. But in Numbers 33, we are going to get a whole list of locations where they stopped at along the way during these 40 years. And we have no idea where these spots may have been or what may have happened at many of these spots. The last few chapters, we did get some, I think, examples of things that were going on during these 40 years. Probably not long after their failed attempt to take the Promised Land. But for the most part, those 40 years are going to come and go, and we're not going to read anything about any of them. Very, 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 very little. We're just going to skip them. In fact, it's going to be so much not a factor in our thinking that we're not even going to bring attention to the fact that we're skipping 40 years. Chapter 20 is just going to go right on and not even acknowledge that 40 years have just passed. Now, it's my personal belief, as I said before many times, that it was very likely during those 40 years when Moses compiled his written works that he had up to that point into a document that is very much close to what we have today. As I've said many times, I believe that the first stuff Moses actually wrote down was probably the stuff that he wrote down at Sinai, which would be the second half of Exodus, and then the law, which is in Leviticus, and the sacrificial system. Yeah. And then, of course, the stuff in Numbers continues on from there and talks about them leaving for the land. And I believe the history parts of this material were probably written by Moses during those 40 years of wandering, and during which the scripture is silent about what happened during that time. I can't prove this, but Genesis, the first half of Exodus, and maybe even the first half of Numbers, I think likely were all written during that period of time. But I cannot establish this definitively, but I think it's very likely. At any rate, we have now passed the 40 years, and we are ready to go back to the Promised Land again, although it's still going to be a while before we actually get in there. We're not going to get in there until the book of Joshua. Right now, we're only halfway through the book of Numbers, so we still have a ways to go. In the first month, this is the first month of the 40th year. It doesn't say that, but it is. The whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There, Miriam died and was buried. Now, there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. There is very little mention about Miriam's death. It just kind of happens. We'll talk about that a little bit in a little bit. So there's no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. So they've been grumbling in the past. Oh, excuse me. And they're still grumbling now, 40 years later. They're still grumbling. I don't know what they were doing during those 40 years, but I'm betting they were probably grumbling, huh? I'm betting. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this desert, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." That's pretty bad. You don't have anything to eat, you don't have anything to drink. That's pretty bad. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock," I don't know what rock they're talking about, but that rock, some specific rock, "before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You'll bring water out of the rock for the community, so that they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels! Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But what did the Lord tell Moses to do? He told it to speak to the rock, not strike it with his staff twice. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give them." So they are going to die in the desert too. Way back when they first were condemned to wander in the wilderness, until that whole generation died off, God said at the time that only 2 of them are going to make it into that land someday, Joshua and Caleb. He didn't say that Moses and Aaron were going to make it. He didn't specifically say they were going to die like the rest did, but he didn't make an exception for them. And as it turns out, they're not going to make it into the land either. These are the waters of Meribah, quarreling. That's what Meribah means, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and where he showed himself holy among them. There is a lot of context here that I think factors into this story that is not, for whatever the reason, written into the text. You have to remember that Miriam was Moses and Aaron's sister. And she dies and was buried, and apparently is just kind of, very unceremoniously dumped, basically. I don't mean dumped like in a, physical, dump the body. I just mean that there doesn't seem to have been, like, any real processing of grief over Miriam's death. There is an ancient tradition that Miriam was responsible for watering the people. I don't know if that's, it's not in the Bible at all, so I'm not going to put a whole lot of stock into that, because it involves her carrying around like this miracle well or something. So I'm not going to be putting stock into that. But there does seem to be a connection between her death and the bad attitude that Moses and Aaron are displaying here, because she was their sister. And I think that does factor into why Moses finally just kind of gets... Moses had been put... And then again, we don't read the 40 years in between. That time period just skipped almost completely. But we've read about these Israelites grumbling before, reading about them grumbling now. It's, I think, completely fair to assume that they probably were grumbling all throughout that time. And it seems as though Moses has finally been pushed beyond the point that he can endure, because now he's even grumbling. Now even he is fed up with the situation and is displaying arrogance, saying that, we must water you, and not following the Lord's instructions. And I think there's a direct connection between that and him being probably in a bad mood from his sister's death, which would have just happened. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, saying... Now Edom are their brothers. Edom comes from Esau, the brother of Jacob. So these are closely related people to the Israelites. And they are already in their land, more or less, compared to the Israelites, which have not arrived at their land yet. The Edomites are settling down into their territory, which will be basically to the southwest of Israel. The Israelites right now are to the south of the Promised Land, and they are going to try to enter the Promised Land. They're going to try to swing around up, traveling north to the east side of the Promised Land and enter from the east going into the west when they cross the Jordan River. The quickest way to get there would be to go through Edom. Edom is, like I said, Esau's descendants. These are Esau was Jacob's brother. So these are brothers to the Israelites, and they have their own territory to the southwest of Israel that they have been settling in now for some time. Esau and Jacob would have lived, a couple hundred years earlier. Jacob, I believe, I said before, the timeline is such: the law was given. Jacob, we read before about how the law was given 430 years after the promise to Abraham in Genesis 15. And that time period is divided up between the rest of the time Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob spent in Canaan, and then from the time they spent in Egypt. And Jacob went down into Egypt in his old age, and they came back up out of Egypt about 210 years later. This is 40 years even after that. Okay, so Jacob and Esau, their time would have been about 250 years earlier. Esau, they were twins. By the time Jacob went down to the land, he was an old man. Of course, his brother would have been the same age because they were twins. And that would have been about 250 years ago at this point. So during that time period, the Edomites have gotten their own territory and are settling down in their own territory, which is the southwest of Israel. And for the Israelites' march into their chosen land, they want to pass through this territory. But they want to do it without a fight. They want to do it without provoking a conflict with their brothers. So anyway, Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, saying, "This is what your brother Israel says. You know about all the hardships that have come down upon us." So by the way, we skipped 40 years in time. So now we are down to the year 1406 BC or so. "Our forefathers went down into Egypt, and we lived there many years. The Egyptians mistreated us and our fathers. But when we cried out to the Lord, he heard our cry and sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt. Now, here we are at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or any vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territories." They do not want to pick a fight with their brothers. They do not want to fight the Edomites. But Edom answered, "You may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with the sword." So the Edomites and the Israelites are no longer friends. If they ever were friends, they're not friends anymore. The Israelites replied, "We will go along the main road, and if we or our livestock drink any of your water, we will pay for it. We only want to pass through on foot, nothing else." Again they answered, "You may not pass through." Then Edom came out against them with a large and powerful army. Since Edom refused to let them go through their territory, Israel turned away from them. I don't know if the Edomites are just being stubborn, or if they're being afraid, or what the deal was. It doesn't say. They just refused to let them passage. We don't know why. They didn't actually fight them here, though. They will fight the Moabites and the Ammonites here in a bit, because they're going to have the same problem there. And they will actually fight them. But they did not end up fighting the Edomites here. However, this would cause a rift between the Israelites and the Edomites that would never really heal. They're never really going to get over this. Even the prophets centuries from now are going to blame Edom for not allowing Israel to go through. This is going to be a sore spot between the nations for really the rest of their histories, honestly. The whole Israelite community set out from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. So they're going to have to take a detour now compared to where they wanted to go. At Mount Hor, near the border of Edom, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Aaron will be gathered to his people. He will not enter the land I give the Israelites, because both of you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. Get Aaron and his son Eleazar, and take them up Mount Hor. Remove Aaron's garments, and put them on his son Eleazar, for Aaron will be gathered to his people. He will die there." Moses did as the Lord commanded. They went up Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community. Moses removed Aaron's garments and put them on his son Eleazar, and Aaron died there on top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, and when the whole community learned that Aaron had died, the entire house of Israel mourned for 30 days. They didn't mourn for Miriam, apparently, but they did mourn for Aaron for 30 days. I don't know if this represents a lesson learned. This could just as easily be reflective of a very patriarchal culture, where the death of Miriam just is not considered to be as important as the death of Aaron. It could be simple as that. But Aaron and Moses were punished for being arrogant and disobeying the Lord when they needed to summon get rock from the water by speaking to it, which I believe again was probably caused by their own bad mood from the previous death of their sister. And so both of them are going to die for that. Aaron dies first, and a little bit later, Moses doesn't die too long after. Now we've still got a book and a half to go through before we get to Moses' death, but in time, it's not that much longer afterwards. Only a few months. Because this is all taking place in the 40th year. This is about 1406 BC.